talk about London because it's a negotiated rather than a fully planned city, and it is actually driven by a strategic plan of statistics and delivery numbers, and a very different sort of city that Joseph Rykwert would have, I think, preferred. And he wrote in The Idea of a Town, "It's necessary to recognize that a place is not neutral. It must be charged with meaning, carefully chosen and formed by ritual acts, and if it is to serve human needs fully." Thought that three really excellent speakers would be, first of all, Patrick Lynch.
Play Benedict in, as I said, I'm going to cross the ball. So all he has to do is nod it into the goal.
And his appropriately entitled books, The Theatricality of the Brock City and Mimesis and Civic Ground, I think reflect those sorts of views that show a certain amount of influence of Joseph. You have Benedict Zucchi, who works at BDP, but has written an encyclopedic book, Big House, Little City, Architectural Design Through an Urban Lens.
And London developing as a series of these either pre-existing villages, or in this sense, the 18th century neighbourhoods that were created. And
board for a series of reflection on architect's relationship with urbanism and how their once intimate symbiosis was unravelled by the international style. Thirdly, we have Matthew Lloyd, who runs Matthew Lloyd Architects.
Throughout his work, Rykwert rejected theories that reduced architecture to a financial investment or just an economic tool.
And on his website, it says very appropriately, "We are contextual architects creating sensitive and distinctive buildings and places. We design unique and beautiful solutions while our projects are grounded in their history and communities." And talking about beautiful, his Bourne Estate project was much feted by ministers after the publication of the Scruton report about beauty as one of the key examples of modern examples of beautiful architecture. There was Sam Lloyd of Green, Lloyd and Adams, who did the the founders' livery company in Smithfield, building this in Temple Bar, which again in The Idea of Town, he talked about the city was a theatre of memory, its monuments and spaces, deliberate acts of commemoration and repositories of shared life. And you don't get much more monuments of deliberate acts of commemoration than Temple Bar itself, and the commemoration that it was actually brought back here to celebrate the history and the entry into the City of London. Then pass you over to Patrick, who is going to start off.
I had the pleasure of meeting him when he was retired. Read his work when I was a student, and in fact when I founded the practice in end of '97, it coincided with the publication of the Dancing Column on the idea of order in architecture. I gave a talk at the Barbican for the Architecture Foundation in the autumn about the ideas in that book, which coincide with Benedict's books. Literally escaped the Nazis by a matter of hours. The only reason he got out was his father had a bank account in England, and the rest of his family perished in the Holocaust. The order of service for his funeral, you probably can tell, it's a strange combination of Roman Catholic crematorian service with the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer of remembrance at the end. Joseph Rykwert, CBE, was an architect, a teacher and a writer. He established the first postgraduate course in architectural history and theory in Britain at the University of Essex in 1967. He subsequently held chairs at the Universities of Cambridge and Pennsylvania. He was awarded the Olivier Gold Medal in 2014. And this is the interesting bit, I think. Joseph was responsible for introducing art history, anthropology, archaeology, phenomenology and psychology into the education of generations of students and architects, many of whom have gone on to become significant. Joseph believed that theory was a form of culturally situated civic praxis, and that architectural praxis, in its profound meaning, as the embodiment of collective consciousness, was the expression of a theory of culture itself, a double metaphor, body and world. Now, this double metaphor thing comes from almost the conclusion of the dancing column, where he says that the metaphor I've been concerned with is more extended, a double one, and it involves three terms. A body is like a building, and the building in turn is like the world. I think in relationship to the idea that the house is like the city is the idea of a microcosm, which you probably know what I mean by that. So it's not just a scalar relationship, it's a proportional relationship, which means it's an analogical relationship, which means it's a poetic relationship, which means that it's a metaphorical relationship. So it's not just small, medium, large, extra large, not quantities. It's a qualitative idea that even small things can be imbued with spirit. And this is part of the kind of Renaissance theory that he is interested in at a very early age in Alberti, which is a kind of form of Thomistic theology, i.e. that there is a divine spark within man, and that man expresses his divinity through architecture, the arts, which is why Michelangelo ends up being called Il Divino in the various art forms, poetry, sculpture, architecture, that he is engaged in. Joseph was a modernist, he was a modern architect, very good friend of Giancarlo De Carlo, Vittorio Brigotti, but he was a very, very strong critic of modernity, i.e. modernity being rationalism, scientism, what Ken Frampton calls technico-instrumentalism, the idea that there's a teleology of history and anything that's religious or mythical is in the past is primitive, and the Dark Ages, and anything that's in the future scientific is in light. And so this kind of metaphor that runs through lightweight architecture equal the future, which until quite recently we all kind of were forced to go along with. You know, technical progress equals social progress, whilst you're doing a building for Lloyd shipping and colonialism. So Joseph was a contrary character because he's somebody who's a modernist, but he's very, very critical of the worst aspects of modernism, i.e. its bad metaphor, its disregard for the city, and its desituated character. He says, the ultimate barbarity is the plain reading. It's not quite what Theodor Adorno said in his book Mimesis, when he's talking about the relationship between folk music and modernism in Russia, in the avant-garde. But something like it underlies much of his work on aesthetics. Plain reading of a building is a univocal, anti-metaphoric account of it that presents it as mute, as meaning no more than itself, the way that it is built and used. Greek architecture shows how buildings should be conceived, how physical forms relate to the fabric of human groups, to societies and communities. Building is, after all, the group activity par excellence, the most entrancing and forceful, the exemplary art of building, an architecture which still invites dialogue and touch. Physical contract across the millennia, it cannot teach us history, it never can, but we may learn from it. So there's a kind of paradox here. This is not binary, it's not this or that. It's that knowledge itself is heuristic knowledge, especially for a profession like architecture, and we learn it through doing it. However, that's not to say architects aren't obsessed with neologisms in particular and theorising. In Adam's House in Paradise, he starts by looking at Corbusier's attempt to reconstruct the Adamic house in paradise, the archaic primitive hut. And what Corbusier does, as it's fair to say, a Swiss Protestant, is he reduces it to geometry, but non-figurative or symbolic geometry. It's two squares, and it's kind of hypo style. It's a plain reading. It's not quite barbarism because he thinks that primitivism is something that continues, but it's absolutely wrong in many ways because it's a physical form that symbolises nothing other than itself. Where Joseph gets to on Adam's House in Paradise is the idea that what architecture really does is act as a threshold between different states of being. So just as Temple Bar was set up by Inigo Jones on the River Fleet to mark the difference between the City of London and the City of Westminster, or if you like, St Paul's and Westminster as different seats of governance, the need for the royal family to come in for coronations, the fact that after the invasion, William the Conqueror gives the City of London its own rights to print money as a way to stop them continuing a war, means that these threshold conditions that exist are the gateways between the territorial, the topographic. But what Joseph believed was that, for example, this is a traditional Jewish wedding with a canopy. In Christian culture, it would be something like a ciborium or a baldacchino, a kind of non-functional. You saw it in the Bernini's baldacchino in St. Peter's in Rome at the weekend, which was the seat where poets and playwrights would come and declaim once a year. It's a symbolic threshold, and original culture, so it's part of the world where there's no physical structures, but there's still, Joseph would argue, a vanity, and there's still a mythic threshold. So this element here, an image of cosmic alignment between geometry symbolising both the order of the stars and astronomy and a way to navigate and to guide you through the world. So it's movement per se. Now, I've written something about this. Spatial and myth are the embodied revelation of the invisible structure of the calendar year, the diurnal and seasonal rhythms that order the liturgical rhythms of the church and of every Western city. In an anthropological understanding, this order is there prior to buildings, defined by a synchronous order of mythic and daily life. It exists even, as Rykwert suggests in the idea of the town and on Adam's House in Paradise, not only in architecture without architects, but in architecture before buildings. Describes an Aboriginal Australian Waninga as a taxonomic map, a handheld makeshift extension of the body and the Milky Way, the place where the ancestors live forever, juxtaposed with the coupling of the ancient pair. Ultimately, these symbolic structures are a way to immortalise the dead, acting as a threshold, a ritual and a mythological complex that almost partakes of the biological nature of man. The symbolic sophistication of the Waninga suggests that it seems remarkable to me that a people who only adopt an excruciatingly uncomfortable form of enclosure as a temporary expedient devise this extraordinary construction and endow it with the majesty of a hope which the apocalypse was to glorify. This is, in effect, a volume which could be interpreted in terms of one's own body, an exposition also of the paradisal plan, part of a passage where the betrothed acted out their own bodies, establishing humankind in imitation of Adam and Eve at the centre of a paradisal plan. These small articular objects act as a map of the world's meaning, whereby an image of their joined bodies and a pledge of the world's consent to their union. This notional shelter, although it was notional, was necessary. Its floor was earth, its supports were living beings. Its trellis roof was like a tiny sky of leaves and flowers. He concludes that even in the modernist theories of Los, and to an extent still also in Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, the idea of a primitive hut is an attempt to invent new myths signifying that human nature is in no way discontinuous from animal creation, that right building should also be seen in some way continuous with nature. The microcosm, which is effectively saying that man has a soul and therefore is a fragment of the cosmos, and that something as simple as a canopy of leaves held up by people marking a transition has an ability to scale up to the scale of the city, not because of its physical form per se. He wasn't particularly interested in aesthetics, and he had a real problem with La Tendenza and the postmodernist exhibition at the Palotti 1974 Venice Biennale, because he, like Carlo Gustav Jung, he asserted that these archetypes were not images, they were modus, they were a mode of being. They're linked to the transactions that occur. He loved London. I think that London for him was some kind of art city, because everything is a negotiation. The villa is the place of otium, pleasure. The city is the site of negotiation, or negation of pleasure, or if you like, negotiation, everyday life. Now, these are some books that kind of lie in the background to stuff that we've been doing. In 2012, I interviewed Joseph for the Venice Biennale when he was my PhD supervisor, and I said, "Why did you write the idea of a town?" I goes, "Why?" And he said, "Because at that time, road engineers were fucking up our cities. You know, the guy called Cumbernauld becomes a professor of town planning at Queen's Belfast. These guys are in charge." And he wanted to tell them that their military metaphor of ancient Rome, which is a kind of sappers, what engineers dream of, you know, a system, was wrong. Because what the Romans did each night was they brought Rome with them. They ploughed a ditch, they cultivated the ditch, they made a north-south and an east-west route, they marked out an image of Rome, and they made a sacrifice. So it wasn't that imitating the physical structure of Rome. What they were imitating was the cosmic structure of Rome in an act of remembrance as a way to ablude the gods, to try to make themselves safe in a foreign land. And so it's a fundamentally poetic, mythological act of recreation. At this time, we had this kind of strange situation where we'd won this enormous commission. We'd been to the OMA, Herzog de Meuron, and Foreign Office to a massive project. And I thought I was completely unworthy of this, and I needed to build on my MPhil at Cambridge with Wesley and Carl and write a PhD about the city as a way to try to understand the task that they'd given me, which included building a block of flats next to the town hall. And part of the project was to turn what was previously a portico that could only be addressed from the south into something that opened itself to the sides and brought the city into coincidence, both the political life of the town hall and the ceremonial life of this part of London. And when we removed a building that had abutted it, it was a kind of typical modernist composition, organised around the service road at the back, pedestrians banished, no porosity north-south of this part of the city. We revealed a scar of brickwork and a need to deal with the side of Westminster City Hall, and the solution was an artwork with Rick Luxembourg that attempted to tell a story about the sustainability, as we now call it, credentials of the building, i.e. a deep south facade with balconies on it, on a very busy thoroughfare that protected the psychological privacy of the inhabitants or amenity of them and people opposite, whilst meaning the building can operate without comfort cueing, i.e. this solar shading. And how that became a narrative to develop an artwork or a series of artworks that attempt to reveal the hidden dimension of nature or ornament within the structure of the architecture. I showed this to Joseph though, and Joseph just said, I like the theory, but why does it have to be kitsch? So, it's like you can't win. You know, theory, running it through, didn't like it. This is the broader context. In essence, as the bells start to ring, the money to shut up. That's an apartment building, that's a block of flats, that's a town hall, that's the cathedral, train station is here. You zoom out a bit here, the ecosystem of this part of the city, it's a kind of microcosm. City of Westminster in microcosm is the kingdom. It has within itself the main representation of buildings. And all we've really done is opened up pedestrian routes north-south that used to exist and a deeper, more pleasant pedestrian route east-west, whilst reinstating the character of the high street. So it's a kind of Victorian vision of a street with a much older porosity that comes from the medieval city running through it. And this is the last piece of the jigsaw, which is about to get planning consent. At one point with library and Fordway House and all the kind of stuff that at various points Section 106 monies was taken away from and paid for construction of the public realm. Last thing to say, this is also part of this argument, I think. It's a 19th century coroner's court with a garden of remembrance built for the victims of the Grenfell fire a year after it occurred, and a new jury room and courtroom. You may have seen this in the press. In essence, it's a civic building. It has an extremely fraught psychological purpose, which is to process bodies that have died in mysterious circumstances, e.g. the verdict at the end of an inquest will be death by misadventure, murder, potentially suicide, things that affect whether you get insurance or not, whether you can be buried in consecrated ground if you're that kind of person. Incredibly difficult experience. We have another problem, which was that paparazzi long lens photography likes spying on these kind of cases. So lots of celebrities are dealt with here. The coroner is the coroner for the City of Westminster, but also she's the King's coroner, so she deals with celebrities, Grenfell, and kind of national disasters. So there's often lots of scrutiny, lots of gossip, lots of nosiness. Francis Bacon was dealt with here, Lord Lucan. And Sir Brian Clark had been here 4 times. And when I was talking to him, ex-students of mine were working with Brian, And I said, we've got this problem, we can't have anybody looking in, but we need natural light, because you could be stuck there all day and it would be divorced from the natural world, it would be terrible. He said, you need stained glass, that will solve the problem of security and privacy, but it will make an emotional, atmospheric tone that will be appropriate to the decorum of not only the existing Victorian courthouse, which is barrel vaulted and top lit, and a kind of secular, sacred secular, as Peter Carr would say. And so you're seeing it here with the evening sun coming in through this red glass wall. At the end of the day, which is when the coroner wants to finish, never wants you back for an hour in the morning, because it's completely wrong to get people in at 9 in the morning. But at the end of the day, when the western evening sun is coming in, last thing, it might be appropriate at that moment that you're made aware of the blood red coloured light coming in through some poppies, which in our culture is a symbol of remembrance. So the last thing I'll say is this Garden of Remembrance, this is a waiting room. We were tasked with making a memorial for the victims of the Grenfell fire, and we realised actually we shouldn't do that because there's thousands of cases processed through this building every year. So there's no names on it. What there is are a series of planters that allow people to sit, and an occluded doorway that you cannot enter. Threshold between. So it's an aedicule, if you like, of it's 1/10 scale of the form of the building, and the building itself is a 1/3 scale of the original. So the microcosm is something now that can hopefully.
And I start with the phrase that is the inspiration of my book, which came out last year, which I came across a long time ago, and I just always loved it. And it said something to me, but maybe I didn't know quite what. If, as the philosophers maintain, the city is like a big house, and the house is in turn like a little city, cannot the various parts of the house be considered miniature buildings? This is in book 1 of the 10 books by Alberti, which Joseph translated. So if you get the English version, the most sort of popular English version, it's translated by Joseph in the late 80s. Latin title is De Re Edificatoria, which actually just means on building. It doesn't mean on the art of building. Joseph added the word art, and I think for good reason. I think I can understand why he added it, but interesting it's people don't seem to comment on that, but it's actually quite relevant, because I think, and you would have picked up on this from what Paddy was saying, that in The Idea of a Town, which is his first book, Joseph was fighting against were different ways of thinking about the city, which represented none of the things that Paddy's just talked about, from Corb's plan for Paris, which is this kind of brutal imposition of these cruciform towers on the historic centre of the city, through theories about economic locations, the Kristalla central place theory, which we were exposed to at Cambridge at the same time as we were sort of meeting Joseph and learning with Peter Carl and so on, and we were sort of horrified at the idea that the city could be just boiled down to a kind of mathematical theory about commerce. That's essentially what it was saying, and it was part of the way that they determined the location of Milton Keynes, for example. And then Joseph talks about, in the preface to The Idea of a Town, he criticises Archigram and these plug-in modules and the metabolists and so on, who had reduced the city to just a glorified kind of machine, sort of living the future before the future had actually arrived, and with absolutely no regard for history, no interest in history. So he says, in the preface, the city was not just a rational solution to the problem. Well, I think this means it should not just be a rational solution to the problems of production, marketing, circulation and hygiene, or an automatic response to the pressure of certain physical and market forces, but it also had to enshrine the hopes and fears of its citizens. He also says in the preface that his original thought for the idea, before he wrote Idea of a Town, was to investigate the kind of magical qualities that so attracted people to Italian towns, Italian provincial towns and Italian hill towns, which I suppose is a point of contact with me because, well, my family's Italian and I always loved these places. In fact, in many ways, I was more inspired by places that had no architect, architecture without architects, where you wouldn't necessarily be able to say, well, this was designed by someone. But one of those magical places is Urbino, and Calvino includes this quote in his book Invisible Cities, which is actually a rephrasing of Castiglione's book of the Courtier, which is almost certainly a rephrasing from Alberti. So indirectly, Calvino is quoting Alberti. And you know, the Ducal Palace, which of course we can name the architect, well, we think we can name the architect, there's a bit of uncertainty about that. But nevertheless, there is this extraordinary property of the city as not just the product of one hand, it can never be, but it is a kind of collective work in progress through time. And with the utmost sensitivity to its location, DiCarlo, who I worked for in the early 90s and wrote about, was fascinated by this image, which shows Urbino from the air as this sort of extraordinary interweaving of architecture and landscape, of the natural and the man-made. And it struck me then, and I still think it's sort of a very powerful way of thinking about it, that history, in a sense, was man-made nature. That history in a city of this type, and in Rome in particular, or in any city, it is a kind of layering of, through time, through history, of buildings of different eras, which after a while acquire the quality of a natural landscape. They are, in a sense, part of the nature that we inherit and we work with. His book from 1966, looking at the future of the city and saying it wasn't, to keep a city like this alive, to regenerate it, to give it purpose and meaning in the 20th century, and it was dying on its feet. You really needed to understand its past, understand what it meant to the people who lived there, and how you could, in a sense, give it new purpose and new meaning into the future. So this very detailed piece of historical analysis of the city was the basis of the master plan for the city's future. Joseph talks about the city as a metaphor for society, and if you think about the world in which Alberti had grown up in Tuscany, this was, about 100 years earlier, in the 14th century rather than the 15th century, but it was the allegory of good government, the fresco in the town hall in Siena, which is still there, and it's a magnificent, huge fresco. And I think it sort of represents many of the things that Paddy was just talking about, and the idea of the city as something that's very much alive, layered through time, but it is representative of the people who live there. It is the microcosm of the wider world. It has all the different functions you'd expect, and it's full of life, and the buildings themselves are not static, monumental, symmetrical, but they are kind of a higgledy-piggledy composition over time, but which is reflective of the life, the happiness and common good of the people who live there. But it wasn't just about the city, it was about the relationship of the city to its wider context. So every city, every city-state had its rural hinterland with villas and villages and a rich texture of interrelated places which together form the importance, the sense of place, which is built on a certain combination, an ecosystem of social, historical and natural factors. I only came across this quote recently, actually very recently, the other week, and Joseph said, if we are to read Alberti as the father of any one notion, it is perhaps as the true ancestor of urbanism, which is a very apt summary of the significance of the phrase with which I began. And I can relate that back to, for example, one of many phrases in the 10 books, where Alberti relates the atrium, salon and so on in a house to the forum and public square in the city. And just as Paddy said earlier, it's not a scale thing. It's not that you just sort of blow up the size of the house and you've got a city. It's actually saying that really some of the things that happen in the house and happen in civic buildings are sort of have a dynamic interrelationship between part and whole. And I think of 20th century buildings, Saniazzolo in Finland by Alvarado is a wonderful example, which I'll talk about in the book. It's a town hall, it's a library, had some apartments, but it has this wonderful quality, a little citadel. But it also has a relationship to the form of the house. So here the courtyard house, which is very close by Alto's own sort of summer refuge, with this extraordinary space that connects to the lake and the vista, and is almost like a clearing in the forest. It's sort of going back to the very origins of architecture. This wonderful image of Alto tending the fire really goes to the roots of what the architecture's origins, which the very word edifice is based on eides, which is the shrine, but it's also the hearth in a house, and the idea of making the fire, making the hearth is the very root of the word edifice, and therefore also the root of building itself. in the book I talk a lot about London, and in particular about the viewpoint of Rasmussen writing in the 1930s. And I say that he was a bit like an ethnologist coming to London and in a desperate hurry to record what he was seeing, because he got the feeling that it was all about to vanish. And he came back, I think, in 1978 and added another chapter to his book, London, the Unique City, in which he said that lots of things that he'd been worried about have come to pass. So London is, there's a rash of tall buildings on the continental model, and what a shame it is, because there was something intrinsic to the very pattern of development in London which he felt was being lost. And I think some of the images we saw earlier show this kind of idea of a piece of city, in this case Bedford Square, growing up as almost a perfect little city-state, in this case centred around the original Bedford House. The idea of a villa, which then becomes a village, and the word village comes from villa, and the word ville in French comes from villa. So these are a sort of house becoming the nucleus, a big house becoming the nucleus of a community, and London developing as a series of these either pre-existing villages, or in this sense the 18th century neighbourhoods that were created, and how far that is from some of the things that have happened more recently, the things that we see around us. And how, if you're thinking about metaphor, what is the metaphor that building suggests to us? Is that an appropriate anchor for a new London neighbourhood? I would suggest not. It's a very hostile form. It's the space around it is, it's a park, but it's not really a park because it's a moat. It's a US embassy. It's not a building that adds to the community that's accessible. And I think Joseph, he realised that the cities are made of public institutions. It's the combination of public realm, public institutions, knitted together with the places in which people live. And I think the kind of residential developments aren't really making the most of the opportunity either. Which brings me just to some concluding thoughts in relation to a project that we're doing in Dublin. I've been working with my colleague there, Dominic, for many years. It's about to finish. It's a children's hospital. But I think in the terms of the city, I think it was something that you can't help but notice these extraordinary Georgian squares in Dublin, which punctuate this 18th century map, and you can see how they are, on the edges of the city, but they are forming spaces around which anchors to new development, and are still very prominent in the city today. And they have the form, you could say almost a monastic form. It is like a sort of giant cloister. So it has something of the structure of some of these collegiate forms that you also see at Trinity College. So there is an idea about scaling up from the smaller elements, the elements of the college, up to courtyards, up to town squares, and even to the scale of what were, in those days, really important civic buildings, hospitals. This is Ireland's first purpose-designed hospital. It was built in the 17th century. It's still a wonderful building today. It's now the Museum of Modern Art. But these were buildings, proud buildings in the urban fabric, that had a very strong presence as landmarks, and also had a really strong relationship to the landscape, to gardens, to outdoor space. Because these were places where, of course, in the context of the hospital, that was the physic garden where you would grow the herbs and the food for the hospital. But in giving, this is actually showing, in a way, giving away the game, but this was our scheme for the Children's Hospital, which is a huge building. It's 165,000 square metres of new development on the end of a rather rambling, ramshackle adult hospital, St James's. And the site was essentially mostly tarmac. There was almost no green space. There were just lots of utilitarian buildings. So the brief to us was really to develop a children's hospital, get planning permission, but also think about it as a regenerative contribution to this part of Dublin. And it's a metaphorical city, but it's also in many ways a literal city, because it's not just because of its size, but because of the different things that go on there. Of course, you're treated and you stay overnight, so there are lots and lots of bedrooms, about 400, 500 bedrooms in the building. But there's also medical school, there's a conference centre, there are restaurants and cafes, there are offices, there are laboratories, there's really almost there's even a parent hotel here for longer stays. So it has the quality of city, and I think one of the things that really interested me, and I think we've demonstrated with this project is the way that you can use Alberti's phrase as an anchor for the process of participation. So it's the urban image is something that everyone can relate to. So it's a very good way of structuring a dialogue. You know, if you're interested in engagement with people and you're developing a project over a long span of time, it's a very effective anchor for decisions and interaction that everybody can relate to. And it gives the building a kind of strong identity, which I think now in just the last two slides are borne out by the building, which is nearly finished. It'll be finished this summer if you want to come and see it. And the axial relationship, the kind of dialogue across time to Kilmainham was a very deliberate choice of ours. And you do experience it now. You weren't really aware of the hospital back when we first got here. You were standing on the ground level, you couldn't even see it. Now you've got this interesting kind of literally conversation across time, across space. And just to finish, I mean, going back to one of my favourite buildings of all time, it's the old hospital in Milan. And this is from the era of Alberti, so immediately after Alberti, only a question of a few decades. Filarete, another one of the theorists that Joseph was very interested in and wrote about, designed the original blueprint for this hospital. And it operated as a hospital for over 400 years. It is now the most wonderful university precinct. And of course, one of the, with the cathedral, the castle, the hospital, these are the great civic buildings of Milan.
Link us through to London and London's current development position. I'm going to read this if that's okay. Joseph Rykwert strikes me as the most gentle man, and although I don't think I ever had the honour to meet him, I can quite see his influence in the work of our best architects in terms of the scale, humanity, care, detailing, and the materiality of their outputs. He believed in the kind of cities we all want to visit, full of public squares, elegant streets, and well-proportioned buildings. Carefully crafted out of long-held principles, he linked the design of cities with human activity and habits as an essential connection to successful urbanism all over the world, as the previous speakers have said. Rykwert's greatest contributions to architectural theory was his rejection of a purely functional approach to buildings. Architecture is building that helps people live, he said, emphasizing that the spaces we live in should not only be the result of technological advancements, but mostly should meet our deeper humanistic needs. Throughout his work, Rykwert rejected theories that reduced architecture to a financial investment or just an economic tool. He argued that unless we understand architecture as a form of social engagement, as has been said, it cannot fulfill its true role. London's historical architectural anatomy certainly would match Rykwert's criteria for a successful city. It's a global city, vast in size and influence. We should be so proud of it, with a great centre, grand spaces, the best parks in the world, public buildings and churches, wide streets shaped by our greatest architects like Wren in the Square Mile and Nash at Regent Street. But mostly, of course, by the industry and energy of us Londoners ourselves. London's corporate architecture, I think, has always been very good. The City of Westminster and the City of London have, to my mind, protected and retained this unique character very well. Different enough from other European capitals to be recognised as its own, distinctive and always enjoyed for what it is, a world-class city and the cornerstone of this whole country. Furthermore, beyond the middle of the city, London's unique collection of village centres, where I presume we all live, with their thousands of nearly identical Georgian, Victorian and then Edwardian residential streets, are wonderful and of course enormously adaptable to contemporary living today. Along comes World War II and swathes of London, particularly in the east, were flattened by bombing. The rebuilding of these blitzed areas was hurried and interventionist and terribly, in my view, underfunded, even though it was a heroic period of rebuilding, leaving our east side boroughs with a poor physical legacy. And I've pulled this slide up because it's a project we're working on. This is a part of Stoke Newington with an extraordinary Grade 1 church in the middle, an X square at the end of it, and to the west, a bomb hit and flattened that part, and to the east, there are the regular houses. And the part, what I think about this piece of just one snapshot of London is the fact that this is an extremely difficult estate called the Shakespeare estate, and these are rising affluent streets. The urban grain created in the 60s, 70s and 80s often lacked humanity, partly eroded, and this partly eroded London's nobility. It's only now that some money is coming back into the East, where I've worked for all my career really, mainly through new gentrification and the pioneering of younger people doing up old houses. I've worked in London for 30 years in Shoreditch. I've seen the practice of architecture change over time from that which I grew up with. Peter said my father was a very good architect, but I'm actually a fourth generation architect, going back to an Edwardian architect called Curtis Green. So I was brought up in old-fashioned ways, in an old-fashioned profession, with strong principles and clear professional standards set by the RIBA. To evolve now into an industry much more governed by power, ambition, money, and above all, intense competition. In the 90s and 2000s, after the Thatcher's years, there was a terrible recession. I don't know, most people here remember that recession far worse than anything else we've had since. There was no housing grants, there was almost no development in the 90s. Council housing had stopped, and we as a practice started to resolve infill sites for social and private sector clients with a different type of architecture, small, self-funded, enabling projects. Then in the 2010s, council housing was reborn. A style called, you all know it, the New London Vernacular was invented, and I think was revolutionary. There was a real heart in the new commissioners of public buildings, such as Camden Council, with the help of many brilliant central London borough planners. And our industry has done some marvellous things in the city in the past 20 years, make no doubt about it. The Olympic Park, the outstanding King's Cross development. These are Rykwert's developments. I think King's Cross suits him perfectly, I would say. There's even Battista Power Station, which is very recent, which in its own way has a remarkable character. So we have done some remarkable projects in this city. In 2015, there was then, a bit like the word dash for gas, but there was a dash for development, I think. And new opportunity areas were outlined by the GLA, predominantly, as you can see, towards the east because of the bombing. I assume that's where the sites were. So outside the immediate centre of London, over the past 10 years, architecture in this city has become turbocharged by very powerful forces, driven by these opportunity areas, and into a frenzy that I think Joseph Rykwert would probably not have appreciated. It has, in essence, become commoditized, leaving the question as to whether the character, as he had advocated during his career, and Greater London in particular, can survive as we've known it. Our original smaller scaled housing, mostly originally houses where we used to live, has been replaced in the 60s by blocks of flats, then the apartment building in the 2000s, and recently the mega block. Tower blocks followed in no time by tower clusters have arrived with us big time. Surely the antithesis of Rykwert's thinking. I'm not sure where all this came from, but possibly out of a realization that serious money could be made from a combination of soaring land values and the sudden urgent political need to manufacture as many new homes as possible with insufficient regards to the results. peak greed in architecture, again, anti-Rykwert, pushing everything to its limits, in fact, produced the Grenfell fire. Even, how many years is it? 7, 8 years after Grenfell, the architectural world in London and it's outside is kind of still going bonkers. We are now producing giant developments, which I think are anti-London and anti any recognisable urban grain. That's not to say the buildings and the architects working on them aren't very good at what they do. I'm lucky enough to sit on design review panels, various design review panels, and even luckier to sit on Historic England's London Advisory Committee. These panels, and I know many of the people in this room are on them, review the good, the bad, and the ugly of today's large developments. But to be honest, we rarely smile when we are doing these reviews, critiquing overdevelopment after overdevelopment. The Building Safety Act, 6 years in the making, now acts as a sort of possible safety brake, restricting height, or at least making it more expensive to build high. Could this possibly be the beginning of a new trend of predominant low to mid-rise housing, so badly needed to make habitable places to live and give ordinary families a chance of excellent housing? So how will London succeed in retaining its nobility and reputation in its new districts in the future? How can London keep control against the forces of excessive developmental commerce? The GLA and our architectural industry in general needs to now actively plan together for a better age, one that Joseph Rykwert would have been proud and delighted to witness. We now need to create a new intelligent London density, planning very wisely, building much more widely across brown and grey land, and then, yes, right out into the suburbs. We need new ideas, and as Cabe did in the 2000s, to once again create excellent, well-scaled, thoughtful, human-centred development. Fundamentally, we need proper master planning throughout and across this great city of London. This is from the Davidson Prize, just recently published, of some wonderful smaller practices, I think, looking at future ideas for low to mid-density housing on the edges of London. And this is the wonderful Fish Island development by Howard Tompkins and other architects, which has a wonderful scale, tight streets, habitable, it never goes over 6 stories. I'm not entirely against height, but what Joseph Rykwert would have wanted is human-scaled architecture. And just a final slide, I found this in looking for this talk, I found this wonderful, from 1943, London County Council plan, presumably looking at future, during the war, I don't know how they did this during the war, but anyway, looking at how, what London should do with itself. And this was a plan to produce many more parks in this great city, which perhaps is a little bit of a signpost to where we should be going in the future. Thank you, Peter.
I'd like to ask all three of you, really looking at the comments that Matthew was just saying at the end there, because at the moment there are people in City Hall who are working away at the next London plan, and that whole concept of opportunity areas and areas of much denser, taller building came about from Richard Rogers' ideas, which were fed into the London plan around the compact city, and the fact that all development for London took place within the Greater London area. What would be your messages to the people in City Hall working on the plan at the moment as to how we move forward into the, let's say, post-COVID, very different economic situation sort of era of development?
Would really help, I guess. I mean, this is a tangential way to answer this question. If more architects became planners, I guess, and more of us were trained. I was fortunate at Liverpool as an undergraduate to be trained in the School of Civic Design, as well as architecture. They were kind of reciprocal. One curious phenomenon of the market that's happening at the moment is we're basically going to get buildings up to 6 stories with 1 staircase, or they're going to go massive. And a colleague of ours who's got 2 kids and lives in a Lebetkin building in Clerkenwell was saying the problem that's happening now is they're only building 1 and 2 bedroom flats in zone 1 and zone 2 because it's too expensive otherwise. And so we're getting this kind of weird suburbanisation of London occurring, which all of us may have done at one point. You know, there aren't very many secondary schools in the centre of London because there's not very many playing fields. All school moved from here to Barnes. There's this kind of ongoing effect. I think that as well as these kind of formal questions that inevitably you get taller buildings perhaps where the planners aren't as good because the local authorities in Redbridge and Croydon are desperate for investment. You know, Liverpool's lost its UNESCO World Heritage site by just kind of going, give us your money, build what you want. Is this kind of Rykwert idea that architecture basically is the expression of a mode of being or a form of life, and therefore you need to find a way to allow families to exist in the city centre. The last government, not the current government, with its bedroom tax thing has effectively led to there's 4 primary schools closing just secondary schools are closing because people are being forced out of the city. So I think it's the family really. That's the essential bit that needs to be protected because the market won't protect families.
Okay, well, go in order then. Benedict, you next.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been to Japan on holiday and experienced Tokyo for the first time, and I mean, it's an extraordinary place and it's full of energy and it has amazing history, of course, but it's also quite frightening because there are no, in a sense, almost like no boundaries to anything. And it blurs the sort of the scale also rises and falls, and you can't really make sense of it, and it's almost goes on forever, of course, as well. You can travel on the fast bullet train, and you can be on the train for 40 minutes, and you're still in Tokyo, and it's hurtling at 200 miles an hour. So it is one, and I mean, it's also joined on to every other place we went to. So we left Tokyo to go to Kyoto, and basically it's continuous urban fabric pretty much the whole way for 400 kilometres. So you just think, well, something in the 20th century has gone wrong there. So it's successful, and it has lots of course, positive qualities. But I came back to London and thought, wow, how sort of green and how modest in scale everything seemed by comparison. But I think that the scale is crucial. This sort of modulation of scale, which is what we've spent some time talking about tonight, and finding appropriate scale and knowing that in a European tradition of city making, you don't need to, you could probably achieve not far off the same number of dwellings, and people have, of course, since, Lionel March's studies in the 60s have shown with Leslie Martin how you could do that 6, 7, 8-story courtyard buildings on a denser footprint can give you just as much amenity space, probably more, and can do so in a way that creates better communities. So I think it needs a rethink.
I mean, I think what you said, Patrick, about outer London boroughs being kind of victim to overdevelopment in the way I described, partly through under-resourcing, or in fact in the kind of historic England terms, as someone said to me, there aren't any historic buildings there, so there's no one to worry about the views to those clustered developments. I mean, what I worry about, London is, nothing can affect the centre of London. The centre of London is a marvellous place. We're standing next to one of the greatest buildings in the world. But wherever you go across its 32 London boroughs, you see quality. It's not just about low rise, but it's about a quality. And I just, even though architecture and architectural expression has improved in my time as an architect, as I say, New London vernacular is a magic invention towards a far greater improvement visually to buildings. But I think we're in danger of monetising our industry to such an extent that it's simply about what you can get away with now, rather than what is humane, where people should naturally live. And again, although I criticise these mega little towns that you're seeing dotted all over the outside, so just outside the North Circular or just inside the North Circular, I don't mind people choosing to, of course it's a free world, choosing to buy a lovely 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom flat. But it's when you put affordable social housing into mega blocks once again, with streets that are tiny and without the London parks that are shown in that plan, without that grand master planning, I think we are in danger of, to come back to the title, of the nobility of London being pulled from under our feet, really.
Sorry, it's James Went from Baker Guinness, cultural consultant. I was inspired by what Patrick said about the soul of buildings, and also that idea of the Roman camp being a kind of form and ideal model of an urban space and how that translates through. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Lord Mayor's event with Gresham College in Guildhall, and he was identifying some problems with, well, I suppose bankers and people in shipping and these things that he's our ambassador for, and are relevant for the City of London and London more generally. But he was identifying this issue that there needs to be more animal spirits. And there's something there which is cultural and psychological, where there is a deficit, perhaps after the financial crash in 2008, but they're making up ground and there's this big push to change. It feels like in all the discussions that we've had, there's something about architecture which is addressing these deeper needs. And I'm wondering if the Lord Mayor's direction is something being picked up by architecture in London, or whether something that, where it might go and how it might fit together.
One of the weird things that's happening is that, nature, it's called sustainability, it immediately turns into a kind of technical issue rather than a cultural issue. And, if we've kind of wrecked the planet for money, through the kind of way in which science has become technology and industry, there is a very profound need, which perhaps much older organisations like the Lord Mayor and the Ombudsman and these types of organisations can do, which is to remind people of hubris and of nemesis and of the limits of arrogant ambition and capital, which at the moment is a kind of theology of itself. It just worships itself, thinks it's neutral, thinks it's value-free, thinks that the market's like a kind of god and we should follow it. And the planners have been the ones checking that through development control. But I think there's a paradigm shift happening where nature suddenly isn't a technical thing, it's a cultural thing, it's an animalistic, it's an embodied, situated experience, and we have an existential threat to that paradigm of greed, development, technical progress, that kind of stuff. And I just think that there needs to be a cultural, or even aesthetic isn't a great way to talk about the nature of human life, because the city is effectively, it's an expression of the political system, it's a polis. Any of these bodies that can influence people who are making plans. The way government works, though, is you've got various government departments. One will deal with disabled access, one will deal with natural ventilation, there's kind of branches to the building regulations, and often what you find yourself doing is like sort of tiptoeing between various bits of law. I do seriously think that some architects should become politicians and get involved in government directly, because there's a lot of using consultation and little bubble diagrams to try and solve stuff. It's like, if you really want to be political, then go and do an MBA, do a master's degree in planning, and become a politician. This is happening in other countries. I think we're at that tipping point where aesthetics doesn't really cut it. But what you're talking about, I think is a profound dimension of the human animal within architecture, within cities.
I was intrigued by the word noble and what it meant in the city, and the qualities of honesty, generosity, courage and selflessness that go into Rykwert thinking in particular. And I sort of wrote down some thoughts about what are the 10 qualities that make a city before I came here. And I just thought it'd just be interesting to discuss perhaps that some of these aspects are stronger than others. The city is safe, the city is prosperous, education is excellent, positive spiritual climate, the morale of a city is high, medical community is well equipped, healthy recreation and entertainment, a government of a city is honest and wise and forward-thinking. That noble identity is expressed in its architecture, which is we've obviously been dwelling on, and that the poor and homeless are well taken care of. Those things seem to me things that, to some greater or lesser extent, we could build upon.
Noble city, apart from Lasdun, who actually wrote that soon after he'd done the National Theatre, and he saw that as a contribution to a noble city, which I think probably Joseph would agree it certainly has been, even if he didn't like it at the time.
So, I think I'd be fascinated to know more about how Joseph went from being a designer in the 50s to deciding that he was going to devote himself to the life he led as an academic and an extraordinary multilinguist, and really delving deeply into history and anthropology and philosophy. But I think he says in The Idea of a Town that he was really interested that no one had picked up on the book The Ancient City, which was written in the 1860s, I think, by Numa Fustel de Coulanges, a sort of French historian who wanted to go back right to the roots of how cities evolved, and he went back to the Greeks, and really the idea of the city being existing for the common good. And Aristotle and Plato, people writing about the city, what it represented, and the very idea of civilization that went with it. And tracing this back to I touched on that, the family, and that each family was a kind of microcosm in itself of society. Of course, it was very paternalistic. It was with the father as the kind of the head of the clan, and it was a question of clans. But it was this idea that the society is greater than the sum of its parts, and the city fosters this kind of common interest. And part of that is built around it starts with the home, but it then becomes a question of shared institutions. I think in the end it's about fostering effective communication, so that people enter into dialogue, so that if you're going to get the most out of each other, you need to be able to interact, do what we're doing tonight, converse, exchange, and not just exchange in a material sense, but exchange in a spiritual, intellectual, and educational sense. And that's really what cities give us. And so we as architects are sort of choreographers of the collective, I think. That's what we are best at, we should be doing, is fostering that dialogue through the spaces and buildings that we create.
The etymology of noble is noblige, gentillesse and noblige, which is the ethos of the medieval court of a knight, so obligation. And I think this is the kind of basis of political philosophy, and that we have duties and we have obligations and we have rights, and it's very much flipped to the architect does what they want, they express their ego, they express the spirit of their age, which might be, in the image of the futurist, kind of violent, because it shouldn't be violent. Right, so I think it's a paradigm shift. I think there's a whole series of ways of thinking about what it is to be a human being, what it is to be an architect. The Ayn Randian fountainhead, which is absolutely asocial. What people like in proto-fascistic view of creativity as new for new sake. I think there's a new fascination in the city which has to do with the communal. Corporate, that word corporate, is corpus body. All of these kind of microcosmic things. The thing I didn't mention, which I'd like to say about your hospital thing, which is really interesting, is so what Alberti does, he's basically is theorising what Brunelleschi did. So the first thing Brunelleschi does is the colonnade of the Ospedale Innocente, so the hospital of the orphans, has a square order based on parts of the body, an arch, and then Alberti says this microcosm, this little hospital, which is just for the poor and the weak, can rock through the whole city. So the merchant, the market, it scales up. The Uffizi does the same thing. All of this is happening within a Roman city, ruins of a Roman city. You just get this kind of the step, the foot, the yard, that bodily scale running through, which is what happens then in Milan. But the thing that's really interesting, I think the crucial thing is that we need to learn to think analogically. Because Trinity College in Dublin is not a monastic settlement. It's a Protestant university done in the image of a monasticum, which is the origin of the aula, which leads to the collegium. But of course, the hospital starts off as the monastery, which is why we still call nuns sisters. Sorry, nurses sisters after nuns. And so it's thinking analogically and not seeing things in the past as primitive and backward or useless, and the future as necessarily shiny and bright, because the future's probably, I mean, lots of people from Agamben, who's a Marxist Venetian architectural scholar who's very influenced Pier Vittorio Arelli, think that the monastic life might be the future, because it's a kind of communist sharing of public space, and so the physical spatial architectural model which is evolving is capable of this analogical replenishment of itself.
Alberti talks about monasteries being, there are some that are closed orders, usually outside the city, and he still describes them as little cities, but he also talks about monasteries as open institutions in the city that should welcome people in for learning, discussion, and so on. I mean, he's anticipating the monastery as a
proto-university.
Yes, as a
proto Market Square in microcosm. Arguably, they're the survival of the Roman city. After the Roman city disappears, it becomes a city of miniature. But that way of thinking, I thought it was very, very powerful that you picked up on the fact that the original hospital has this, the same typological structure as the universities, and that therefore drawing people's attention to that strategically, when you make both a garden and this kind of microcosm of the city, drawing attention to another city. I think that this type of kind of recuperation of body and recuperation of mind, that it's not just a physical thing. It's like getting better in hospital. It's being able to walk and see things. So I'm just going to do this. It's a cool point I want to make. I'm supervising a PhD at KU Leuven, and it's about the differences between Flemish architecture and French-Belgian architecture. And one of the case studies the students are looking at is the two university hospitals for the French-speaking part of the university split off in 1968. The students didn't want to be taught in Dutch anymore, and they formed Louvain-la-Neuve. It's a new town, has a French-speaking university, and they built a hospital. And the French hospital is a car park, a block with a point tower on it, because it's entirely French and rationalist, and it's all about the efficiency of the doctors being able to get around. And 20% more people die in it than the Flemish one. And the Flemish one, when they built outside the medieval city walls, is next to a village. And the only room that's air-conditioned is the operating theatre, and everybody walks everywhere. And there's literally a market square, which is the market square of the town, where you go and have your cup of tea if your relatives visit you. And it's like Giancarlo De Carlo was doing. It's taking the medieval city as a typological model for health and well-being. We don't kind of know about these things because it doesn't. The art historical view of architectural history, which was there was old stuff and then there's new stuff, and that every architect is a kind of idiot savant genius who should reinvent the wheel. How original. The only, I was on the education committee for years and years and years, and we were looking at why are these projects winning every year that are fish farms on Mars? The only criteria for any RMBA award, if you trace it back, innovation has to be innovative. Well, who says?
The RMBA.
Yeah, but that paradigm is coming from. I think a dead paradigm.
But the interesting thing there is that Alberti and the Renaissance were innovative, but by going back to go forward.
Oh, exactly.
So they were really
It's a renaissance.
making sense, yes, a rebirth of ideas that they brought up to date and were inspired by.
Yeah, so creativity and mimesis and things which we recognise are the full wellspring of creativity, which is sharing in other people's imaginations as well.
Can I just come back to Chris's 10 points or 12 points, whatever it was, of what a city should be or what a city is? That's fabulous. But we as architects are only partly or very little in control of that actually. It is about governance, it's about culture, it's about this kind of evening in a way, it's about planning. And I actually don't attribute, I've never thought blame the planners because they're stupid or they don't. I didn't say that, we often hear it. I don't think it's a question of poor planning. And I don't even think it's a question of a poor culture. I think it's a poor development culture, which is in a runaway state. And all of the things we've heard this evening inspire you to be an architect, inspire you to think about your work, inspire you to make better places. But I think the problem is, and we're only really talking about new development, because London is very protected. Central London is extremely protected and it'll outlive all of us, but it's where we're doing new things, we're changing a culture, and we can't just use a kind of formula to make places that sort of suit the regs, and we can push as hard as we can, no theory, no love of place, but simply about what you can get out of it.
No principle.
But if you say that architects don't have the power or the influence, then where are the civic designers? I mean, you trained as you did civic design.
Architecture, but we had lectures in urban design.
But do we have urban
so,
designers in this country?
You know, I mean, I would guess that one of the issues around planning is that a lot of planning is regulatory rather than visionary, and who delivers that visionary element. And
The town planner, I'd just like to offer a view. For me, the nobility of London is it's not derived from its architecture. I think it's derived from its long-term resilience, its continuity. It's a place that people have loved living in and continue to love living in. It's actually derived from thousands and thousands of non-architectural decisions. It's estate surveyors laying out fields after fields where where the developments interface with each other, which creates that sort of incredible pattern of townscape. So for me, the nobility of London is its townscape. It's superb sort of series of grids and its urban layout, which is resilient, allows coherent and proper development to take place. A lot of recent development has failed to acknowledge the quality of that underlying pattern.
But what do we have to do to go back to that? In contemporary terms, where do we go to, if that is what made London noble and great, what do we have to do to get back to that point as an industry?
have you got an answer, John? Is that why you put up your hand?
Sort of. So I just wanted to finish on a sort of positive thing, because I think one thing that's been missed, you were saying about how generally you feel optimistic about London, and I most feel still very optimistic about London, and part of it is shown, what's causing it for me is the difference between what's on the screen now and what we've experienced in the last 2 or 3 big infrastructure projects, where London somehow has managed to dodge what that plan would have implied, and which was the plan of many, many cities. And if you look at you think you could be a map of Paris, you just somebody had done, and we got very close to trying to build that. Somehow we go through all this chaotic stuff that we've been talking about in the 80s and 90s and so on. And we've now, the glimmer of hope to me is now we seem to have this very coherent, fast ways to travel, and no easy way to travel by car. So you have to get onto the tube or travel somewhere. So now suddenly it's about places when you emerge from one of those things. And now you're back to a scale that I think does sort of make it possible to think in the squares and piazza that you've been talking about. How you deal with the 60-story dual staircase building, that's the big one. But I think there've been some very optimistic, at the same time as the infrastructure, we had COVID, the transport planners took over most of the road space and created a lot of, there's just a lot of places now that are well landscaped. And that's our hope somehow, that we can do this. And I think what draws people to London now, partly, is this sort of infrastructure thing, that it can be perceived as a series of incidents, and therefore our job is, and brings it back to a scale that architects can deal with, of creating individual places. And at a weekend you go out now and you just find lots of people thronging well-designed spaces. That's what they want to do.
Very good. We should finish up in a minute, so let's go around and just have a last comment from each of you.
An observation, I know I met David Argent and your client at King's Cross, who was an architect, and he told me when he was an undergraduate at Cambridge, he wrote his dissertation about banks that were set up in the Midwest as the kind of key civic anchor. So they're built in this kind of palazzo analogy of they're strong, they have a battered base, they're like the kind of Medici banker idea. he was obviously interested in money as a young man, and you know, blah blah blah. But it's having architects as clients, I think, is extremely important. One thing I've noticed that's started to happen during COVID is, which is I think a really, really completely unexpected effect of Grenfell, is, which if anybody's writing a new London plan needs to get on really quickly, is that in the past we would have relationships with clients, they would set our fees and we could negotiate with them. Now there are frameworks and there are project managers between us and clients, and often between us and planners. And these people are surveyors mainly by training. And if it's not illegal, they will do it to your building when you become a design guardian and they take over and you have planning consent. And these people are the people that the clients are offloading their, I would say, civic responsibilities to, because Grenfell has terrified everybody that you might go to prison for corporate manslaughter. So exactly what we thought would happen hasn't happened. The architect is not in control, the architect is being sidelined. And you've got somebody with a kind of BTEC in architectural technology in charge of spending billions of pounds of local authority money and even large developers. So what we need is clients. We need clients who are educated as planners or as engineers or as architects. That's what we need. And I don't know how one finds a way to enshrine that in law, but they're offloading their civic responsibilities, i.e. their culpability, to people who know nothing about architecture, nothing about cities, nothing about tectonics, nothing about the underlying reasons why things look the way they do. And it's a real turning point, I think, in our industry, because I think the profession is in jeopardy of the values that we have. We used to be able to talk to planning colleagues about, talk to engineers about, talk to clients about. I think that dialogue is now,
But you might say that changed when design build came in 30 or 40 years ago.
With design,
So we should move.
straight design build was heaven in the old days, because there weren't so many barriers between the architect and the building. I think we're in danger of being run by regulation to the extent that it's struck me during this talk that the London Housing Design Guide that GLA produced, which has transformed, for instance, housing design in this city, is now there just to be tested against. It's now there to be sweated and sweated and sweated. In a funny sort of way, the more regulation you put before a development team, the more, as long as they're within those boundaries, they'll manipulate that. So actually the kind of old-fashioned dream of an architect inventing a city or thinking about great places to live has dissolved in front of our eyes. It doesn't mean, by the way, I mean, I've often thought we produce in this country the most wonderful architecture. It just doesn't happen to be, it rarely happens to be within a tight master plan. Named Argent are a fantastic client, British Land, these big proper developers and local authority councils in well-resourced local authorities. These are the clients that make the difference because they are visionary. Without the vision, we have very little.
Benedict, last word.
I was just thinking the paradox that 80% of cities are houses, residential areas, and yet architects traditionally were not involved in the design of houses at all. And until the era of, the modern era of social housing, architects didn't even get involved in the dwellings in which most people live. They were designing if they were designing houses at all, it was the palaces of the elite only. What they were actually focused on, I still think it's our ultimate vocation, are those things that are common to everybody. So the architect would work on behalf of, the government, the noble, the city-state, look at the defence of the state, the walls, the castles, the law courts, the town hall, the churches, the educational institutions, monasteries and so on, and the public spaces, the streets, the organisation of the city. And that was the kind of negotiation. The architect was a sort of I still think we are at our best when we are joining the dots together. So we are not trying to do everything. We're trying to sort of bring it together as kind of public art. As to what we do about housing now that people don't build their own homes, that's the real dilemma. So they aren't built gradually over time as they would have been through generations and through collaboration. they are, you know, they have to be designed by somebody or built by somebody other than the people who live in them. It's a whole kind of discussion in itself.
Yes. Well, I guess it's joining the dots together is the difficult thing in creating noble cities. And with that embarrassing, Bob, we've talked a bit about King's Cross, but I think it's very interesting when you compare King's Cross with Nine Elms, for instance. You know, lots of the same architects working on, or same quality architects, you might say, but a very different approach with 27 different landowners, different approaches with ideas of working together, but they can't quite get it together. And the detail between the buildings just is lost, which has been so much a focus
on that,
of somewhere
that was a slide that I put on the screen, was this point about metaphor. Because I think Rykwert was really came across to me more than ever in rereading some of his works recently, you know, ahead of coming here, was just the associations that buildings suggest to people is really important. That sort of other dimension of it's not just a functional object, you know, a product of the market, but it has almost, whether you want it or not, it's going to suggest things to people, and you've got to think about what is the image it suggests, and what is the metaphor that it embodies.
Right. The Shard, which of course Renzo Piano designed to reflect the spire that Southwark Cathedral didn't have, and reflects sails of the boats coming up the Thames. And so I said, I'm a big fan of the Shard, I said to Joseph, and he said, well, I don't like it. And so I said, why? Expecting to have a great story about references and humanity and all that sort of thing. He said, I just don't like it. And he had that sort of nice, gentle smile that he gave to everybody when he didn't want to say any more. And he
Can I top that? What he's actually said about it in print was, if that's a spire, then money is our god.
Very good. Right, okay. Well, we'll end on that. So a very thoughtful discussion. So do please thank our speakers in the normal way. And